possible, but not through the some kind of settlement or agreements, but simply by defeating Russian army.
Well, Sasha, here is where I emphatically agree with you on what has happened. Remember, in previous shows, I have discussed the fact that the correlation of forces seem to be constantly moving in favor of Ukraine, and that the momentum of Russia's offensive was steadily diminishing as Ukraine's attacks on Russia's oil refineries, their infrastructure, their logistics, using missiles and drones and so forth, were having a cumulative damaging effect on Russia's ability to maintain operations. Now, as I had projected, the Ukrainian military leadership has identified the decisive time has arrived for it to engage in counteroffensive operations and to begin reversing the gains that Russia had previously made, which, as Zelensky has pointed out, they have been successfully doing. And now what they're doing, and what has surprised me, and I will tell you, it has surprised me, is the extent to which Ukraine has assumed the counteroffensive. I had assumed that the Ukrainians would be looking for the decisive point and would be looking first to engage in a decisive counteroffensive in what I deemed was the most important, the Crimea. Well, they are engaging in counteroffensive operations against Crimea. They aren't going all out to sever the link and so forth as of yet, but they are having a damaging effect on the ability of the Russian occupiers to defend themselves. But at the same time, they have undertaken counteroffensive actions in other sectors of the front on the eastern portion of Ukraine, as you've pointed out. And the Russians are now, contrary to the opinion of many Western analysts, they have lost the momentum. They are no longer winning the war of attrition. They are not only have been losing the war of attrition, but they are now losing, as you have pointed out, what they value most: territory. They are losing territory, the territory that they have been gaining. So yes, I would emphatically agree with you. This is a very positive development, and it is something that we should all give thanks for, because now this should encourage both the Europe members of the European alliance as well as the United States to continue doing what it is doing, bring more economic sanctions. And President Trump has been emphasizing that we should lower the price of oil, do everything we can not to buy oil from Russia, to reduce its ability to produce income, which it would be having to use to sustain its offensive. So all of these factors, when you take them all together, point to very positive developments for Ukraine as a whole, and certainly for the West. So it is something we have had to be very patient about for the past several years, but now we are starting to see events come to a culminating point. The culminating point that Clausewitz described in his book On War, when the attacker runs out, his offensive essentially runs out of momentum, and then the moment arrives for the defender to undertake the counteroffensive. So I would agree with you. This is a very positive development.
Furthermore, sorry?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
the intensity that Ukrainians are now carrying their attacks against Russians on all front. Crimea, I've seen the pictures. There is nothing you can see except incredible damage, fire, smoke. That's all what you can see in Crimea. There is nothing else. The airports, the terminals, the ports, all kind of infrastructure object, and still remaining this oil refineries. They're all being destroyed one by one. There is nothing to hide. They don't even touch Crimea bridge, maybe to allow Russians to escape. Otherwise, they have to just go and
They'll
jump
let you
to
leave. We'll give you just enough room to leave.
Yeah. So this is an incredible advance of Ukrainian forces. And by the way, even if Russia would now change their mind and ask for a peace, I don't think that Ukrainian would even listen to any peace proposals from Russians.
No, because they know the Russians will be just buying time. They're trying to buy time. They don't have any time left to buy.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
so now Ukraine says, okay, we're taking the initiative. We're going to force you out of Ukraine. You didn't listen when we were trying to make peace. You wanted a ceasefire. You didn't want a ceasefire. Now we have taken matters into our own hands, and we are going to compel a peace. We are going to win a peace on the battlefield, and that, as unfortunate as it may sound to some people, it is superior. It is a superior way of gaining a peace to simply trying to negotiate it with diplomacy or to offer incentives. In this case, no, the Russians have proven stubborn enough so that they must be compelled to accept a peace. And now this is a decisive moment in the Russian-Ukrainian war, and I believe that in the coming weeks and months, in the last few remaining months of the year, I would project, Sasha, that if events keep going on their current course, that we'll suddenly see by the late fall or beginning months of winter, we will see the evidence of the Russian position collapsing, in fact, on the Ukrainian front. And at which point we will be talking about something very different. Now, remember what I talked about last program, when remember when I talked about that element of desperation. This is what we have to be cautious about now. Because remember, I used the example of the behavior between Japan and the United States during 1941, when the U.S. cut off steel and oil exports to Japan, and Japan was confronted with two stark choices. One, they could either surrender, in effect surrender, stop their intentions to mount an aggressive war, which to the Japanese mindset of that time was unthinkable. To them, they would rather die than surrender. So what they did, in spite of the fact that the U.S. Navy had successfully predicted that, yes, the Japanese could attack Pearl Harbor, but it would be strategic suicide for them to do that. What they failed to reckon with was the desperate mindset of the Japanese leadership. And so the Japanese decided, we're going to take our chances and attack Pearl Harbor. And as you know, of course, you know the rest. But now, if we fast forward to the 21st century, and I've told you about previously the studies that I had done during my dissertation research, looking at Russian discussions of the so-called crisis of capitalism, that eventually, as the socialist revolution continued to gain successes throughout the world, that the capitalists, particularly the United States, would eventually become so desperate that they would lash out with their nuclear arsenal in a desperate attempt to reverse the situation. That is why the Soviet leadership at that time had declared that it was necessary for the Soviet Union to be able to fight, survive, and win a nuclear war with the United States. Not that they had the ability to do that, but they recognized that in order for them to politically survive, they must state that as their strategic goal and intent. So now, if you take this and fast forward into the 21st century, here we have, I assert that my research reveals essentially that the Russians tend to project, to mirror image, to project their thinking onto the West and intentions, that that the West would react in much the same way that the Russians themselves would react if they were in a similar situation. So now the Russians are being put into a desperate situation. They are losing their war in Ukraine. Putin's dream of restoring the Russian Empire is dissolving. It is disappearing in front of his eyes, even though he does not wish to publicly admit that, but he is increasingly being confronted with reality. And if once that reality sinks in, and particularly if Putin perceives that he does not have much time left on this earth, that he is in fact dying and he will not achieve his dream of earthly immortality, with organ transplants or whatever other nonsense he talked about with G, that he might well be tempted to lash out with his nuclear arsenal in a desperate attempt to reverse the situation. That is what we must be very careful of. That is in part why I would assert why the United States has gone to increase production of Patriot missiles and why they are agreeing to increase aid in ballistic missile defense for Ukraine and others. And the Europeans are for their part, doing much the same thing. They are going to be increasingly convinced that they must increase this aid and at the same time reduce Russia's ability to continue the war. But keep in mind, if that occurs, there is a moment of desperation, which we hope are able to convince the Russians, don't even think about lashing out with your nuclear arsenal, because we have one too, and ours work. And we haven't corrupted our nuclear logistics system the way you have.
I think in exactly information what I've seen lately, there is increasing preparedness of countries like Poland,
Yes.
not only to fight, and they have already building up 600,000 strong army.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful news, and very convincing too to someone like Putin.
Getting all the latest, the best equipment, including, of course, armor and ammunition, weapons of all kinds, including, actually, they now request nuclear weapons based on Polish territory.
Yes.
They are very directly, without mincing the words, nuclear weapons on our territory. Full stop.
Oh yes, they had been asking, Sasha. They'd been asking for that for years, and they since the 90s, ever since the Soviet Union collapsed. When they wanted to become members of NATO, and they became members of NATO, they had stated not only their desire to have nuclear weapons, but their desire to have ballistic missile defense systems on their territory. In other words, they wanted to be the forward shield of NATO, and of course the Russians reacted very strongly to that. They react both to the desire to have nuclear weapons on their territory, and also, even just as great was their fear of having ballistic missile defenses on their territory, because that would in part neutralize the one thing that makes Russia a great power. And that they had made veiled threats that if they put BMD or nuclear weapons on their territory, that Russia, in a sense, threatened to take them out. Well, they may have been talking about it then, but right now they are not in a very good position to take anything out.
Jonathan, you know, if you know or remember the map of Europe, the only way how Russians can really attack the Baltic states and Poland and farther along is the former Königsberg. Now it's
Kaliningrad. That little enclave. Yes,
it's a little enclave. And what do you think about plan to initiate fake attack from Kaliningrad to either against Poland or somebody else, and then completely destroy Kaliningrad, completely wipe it out. And then Russia will completely lose any means of attacking any European countries.
Well, taking out Kaliningrad would be a very plausible action for NATO. I cannot testify to or say that NATO does have such a plan. However, I'm indulging in a bit of mirror imaging myself. If I were a NATO planner, I would certainly be looking seriously at a plan for NATO to absorb or occupy Kaliningrad and deprive Russia of that forward base, and certainly cut it off and isolate it. And that would be
purely defensive action on behalf.
Oh yeah. And we could justify it as a purely defensive action on NATO's part, because we would say this represents a threat to the security of the NATO alliance. And so, again, given the fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine for reasons which are not really plausible, the Russians would have even less reason to justify, in the eyes of the international community, NATO taking out and absorbing Kaliningrad. So this is it's a very interesting set of dynamics that's going on right now.
What's interesting also, on the economic front, the European Union, in its 19th package of sanctions against Russia, is seeking a ban on Russian liquefied natural gas imports by 1st of January 2027, just a little bit more than a year from now.
Mhm.
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas, European Union High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, as reported by European Pravda. Details: the European Commission is seeking to ban imports of Russian liquefied gas into the European Union by January 1st.
And who do you
Russia's
think's going? Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
Russia's war economy is sustained by revenues from fossil fuels. We want to cut these revenues, so we are banning imports of Russian LNG into European markets. It's time to turn off the tap. We are prepared for this. That's very interesting. It goes in accordance with Trump just asked Europeans to do to cut
Yes.
their liquefied gas and oil exports and so on. I'm just curious how they're going to deal with Hungary and Slovakia, who are interrupters of all
Yeah.
Union actions against Russia. There is actually one way. Lately they are making a lot of their votes by simple majority instead of 100% in inclusive vote. So if
Yeah.
that's the case, then Hungary and Slovakia basically have no voice at all.
Right. Right.
Just
Exactly.
what
That
exactly?
actually, believe it or not, that makes sense. Now, from the U.S. perspective, for example, just to use a parallel example, in the U.S. Senate, in order to confirm Trump's nominees, they changed the rules so that instead of having to have 60 votes, they just have a majority vote, which the Republicans have. So they're able to confirm all of Trump's. So the United States perfectly understands that logic. So they would be absolutely in agreement with that. And
Well,
also,
nobody's against it either.
no, it's just so no, it's and the other interesting thing is that the as far as that oil and natural gas, the United States is fully prepared, has the capacity to increase to divert its exports of liquid natural gas and oil to Europe. Is will
Well, it
take
will
their
take
place.
some time, and this is a year,
Yes.
slightly
Mm.
over a year, will give US enough time to
Yes.
increase production and fill the
Yes.
tank and so on.
Exactly. So
So it's
so that all fits together very logically. It now those moves now all culminate and make sense. You now have a more or less unified strategy, both economic as well as military, which Ukraine can take advantage of to press its military advantage of its counteroffensive. Now they have a much firmer footing on which to unleash counteroffensive actions against the Russian invaders. With the key is keep up that pressure, keep reducing the ability of the Russian economy to sustain its war effort, keep up their attacks on the refineries and the all the deep infrastructure, keep striking deep and making use of their new technology to basically defeat the Russians on the battlefield, something which nobody, very few Western analysts have even thought or entertained the possibility of Ukraine emerging victorious against a seemingly much larger opponent. And yet it is happening, like David versus Goliath.
Jonathan, have you noticed that even in the Western press, there is a less and less rhetorics about Russia being much bigger country, a much stronger army, and this or that. No, I haven't seen it in the last few weeks. I think it's all gone. I think
Yeah.
people realize that it's not so.
And I agree with you. I kept seeing these analysts, just looking at the raw numbers and saying, well, oh, Ukraine's toast. If Russia can win a war of attrition, and they were essentially buying the initial Russia propaganda narrative. Is what they were doing. They were allowing the Russians to do their thinking for them, which is never a good idea. And so in this case, they have successfully they are now being confronted with reality. They are taking the blinders off, and they are seeing what the Ukrainians are capable of doing. They finally, at first, they thought the Ukrainians were just being lucky, but instead, or that the Russians were being exceptionally incompetent. Well, actually, it's the Ukrainians have been exceptionally clever in making the most of what they have, and being bold and taking these daring initiatives to neutralize various aspects of Russian military power. And instead, what you have is a Russia that is being shown to be a helpless giant. If it's a giant, it's a helpless one, a clumsy one that is taking lots and lots of punishment. I remember, I got to tell you a little amusing story. When I was a cadet at West Point, and I was in boxing class, boxing was required for, and my boxing coach, he would watch me in a practice boxing match, and he said, "Lockwood, you can take more shots to the head without falling down than anyone I've ever seen." Not exactly a compliment, because I managed to pass boxing by my ability to take punishment, not by my ability to throw effective punches. I just outlasted my opponent. But fortunately,
So
Russia's not even in that good a shape. They can't even take punches anymore.
Jonathan, what do you think in today's situation? I think if Trump really a good friend of Putin, as he trying to tell sometimes, maybe he should send Vitkov one more time to Moscow, asking Putin
While you still have what? Yes,
pull out
yes.
Ukraine.
Right, Vladimir, pull out while you still have a country, okay? You just go home, lick your wounds. We won't bother you. We are not going to invade Russia. You've got enough problems. You're going to have to worry about China. China is the one that Russia has to worry about, because China is really, when you think about it and you look at their forces and their economy, they're not the world's best economy, but they're still in a lot better shape than Russia. They haven't engaged in military adventures. And if anything, China has legitimate grievances, when you look at their history, against Russia, against the territories that in the East that China believes is rightfully theirs. And they may well
they
be.
published recently new maps of Siberia, and most of the cities like Vladivostok and others, they all have Chinese names. Completely
What does that
different.
tell you?
So Chinese have a long-term approach. And by the way, don't you think that in this Russian-Ukrainian war, China is the biggest beneficiary so far?
Oh, yes, because Russia is being decisively weakened, not Ukraine. The Chinese don't care about Ukraine. They're not worried about reaching that far. They are more concerned about the territories which are on their border with Russia, which the Russians and Chinese did clash during the Cold War. Remember 1969, along the Ussuri River, there were military clashes. But that was just a small precursor of what was going to come. And I would argue that in the 21st century, once Russia has been sufficiently weakened, that they will, even once this war ends and the Russian soldiers return home and Russia has to deal with its demographic problems and its population shortages and its economic recovery problems, that China is going to be in a very good position to take advantage of this and essentially occupy. They will move into those territories, and Russia will not be able to oppose them seriously.
Jonathan, they don't even need to occupy. In Siberia, there are a lot of villages and small cities where Chinese men, not women, but men, they have more than 50% population in this particular places. They all married to Russian girls, women, so on. And if there will be a right time, and it could be any time, it could be tomorrow, they will hold referendums in these places. The Chinese will easily any referendum. No. By the way,
they can win and voluntarily join China. They could voluntarily do that, and the Chinese military, again, even though the Chinese do not have the same ability to project their military power globally as does the United States. However, for territories on their border, they have more than enough capability.
And I remember the last military parade in China, which was shown all over the world. They don't look that weak at all. frankly, to deal with at least local issues like Siberia or some other places. They have more than enough. Interestingly enough, I've come across news that U.S. is going to bring back their base in Afghanistan.
Bagram, yes.
Yes, Bagram. Hello. So, what do you think
Yes,
about that plan?
now, that I would consider that an example of realpolitik. They're saying, okay, we lost in Afghanistan. It says it, and they would now negotiating with the Taliban, and said the Taliban says, okay, we're not your permanent enemies, and the United States, given decent diplomacy and economic incentives, could convince the Taliban. Says, okay, yeah, we'll let you use that. We'll give you that base, and given certain give them certain agreements. Now, mind you, that would be a deal that President Trump could make, and that would be within. I would call that is within his skill set, and he would be.
It could be done in an hour and a half instead
Yeah,
of Ukrainian Russian
yeah.
peace. It's impossible.
He would see those negotiations as much more attractive, and
Yeah.
with a much better payoff. That appeals to his way of doing things. So yes, I would say that initiative to get back the use of the base in Bagram would be a deal that the United States could make, and make very, shall we dare use that, profitably, a very profitable deal for both parties. And so there is promise there. So I would say that the emerging situation, it does surprise me, the vigor of the counteroffensive actions that the Ukrainians are taking, because I was starting to have my doubts. I said, okay, are they going to throw the punch? Are they going to make that counteroffensive action? Where? When? How soon? Because they don't have forever, but their Russian opponent is very quickly tiring out. They are showing a lack of ability to prosecute the war successfully. So now I would contend the moment has arrived for Ukraine to take its destiny into its own hands, and they are successfully doing so, and I applaud that absolutely. The only thing also I would add, though, remember, even if Ukraine if and when, and I'm confident that they will, successfully conclude this war in their favor, that it will still be necessary, because remember, it's a continuation of politics. Peacetime, they will still have a great deal of rebuilding to do, convincing the Ukrainians who have fled Ukraine to get away from the war. You can come on back now. We need you to help rebuild Ukraine, to help rebuild the damage. And Ukraine will be very, very busy in the months and years after this war ends in getting economic aid, investment, and dare I say it, promote tourism. Say, hey, come and see Ukraine. They would certainly have a much better case. By the way, they would have a much better case than Russia, because right now it reminds me of a very amusing poster that when I was an intelligence officer at Fort Huachuca, we had a poster, because we taught classes on the Soviet threat, and we had this poster in our office that showed Soviet tanks rolling down Red Square, and it was a make believe poster, tourism poster, and it said, "The Soviet Union, visit us before we visit you."
Actually, what's interesting will be, once hopefully the war will be over, there will be something what's called military tourism. So people arriving to Ukraine, they will be taken aside. Okay, here where we defeated Germans in 1944, for example, and here what we did to Russians in 2025. Look at this.
Well, think about it. In the United States, keep in mind, in the United States, there are still many Civil War battlefields.
Yeah.
that are regular tourist sites. People come to see it, and you have Civil War guides who are very knowledgeable about what went on in those things. In the state of Virginia alone, there were hundreds of battles that were fought during the American Civil War, but 123 battles of the American Civil War were fought in the state of Virginia, one state. That was the biggest battleground of the American Civil War. Over a couple 100,000 soldiers for both sides died in that state, that one state. The largest battles, of course, were like in Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, or in Maryland, one big one in Antietam, the two times when the South invaded the North. But other than that, there are Civil War battlefields all over Virginia where you can go, and you'll have guides that could take you, say, this is where the attack occurred, this is what happened during the battle. And yes, so I would not doubt for a second that once the Russian-Ukrainian war ends, that if in future years that there will be, you can have military tourism. You could have, the Ukrainians could, have people from Europe visit the sites of the Russian-Ukrainian war and see where they defeated the Russians, particularly in the East. That's where all the battles are taking place. And so I have no doubt of that. By the way, you know about it, that there is a fairly significant war game industry. There are commercial companies that produce. There are companies, and I have a fairly significant collection myself of military war games. And one of the things is that these war game companies have produced games on practically every war in history at every level, strategic, tactical, operational, and they have produced a lot of games on the Eastern Front, World War II on the Eastern Front, which is probably the most studied war in history outside of the Soviet Union. But I predict that once this war ends, there are war game companies out there right now in the United States that are studying this war very carefully, not because they're going to be advising the government on how to fight wars in the future. They're going to want to produce a game on the Russian-Ukrainian war. Sure. They will, and Ukrainian children will be playing that game in
and
decades.
There will be many companies who will definitely take it.
Yes, with there absolutely no doubt, and it will be and the thing is, it will be not only a game that will be played, but it will be the Russian-Ukrainian war will be very heavily studied in the years to come, because it will teach very valuable lessons to both sides, and hopefully the West will learn a lot more from this war than the Russians do. And hopefully the Russians will learn one big lesson: don't attack Ukraine, ever. If that's the one lesson they should learn. And hopefully that is when there's... Go ahead.
At this time, there are basically two armies in the world who could really fight the modern war of 21st century. It's a Russian army and Ukrainian. Actually, I would change Ukrainian army and Russian army who is trying to learn from Ukrainians how to fight. But it's too little too late. I think by the time they will learn anything, they will be most likely dead. Anyway,
and what the United States Army is doing right now is they are taking very careful notes. Believe you me, they are taking. So this is how the war is going to be.
Europeans. Poland is making a lot of new agreements with Ukraine, especially in drone technologies and so on, and they are planning to together fight against Russian drone invasions and so on, which will follow. I don't think that it was the last Russian attack when about 20 drones ventured into Polish. And also some people believe that it was by mistake or something, by incident, but they had a lot of extra fuel, which would allow them to fly such a long distances as the middle of Poland. So it was not an accident, at least that's what I believe. And
I would say you're probably right. Is that was a probe, and they were trying to see how far they could get those. They were trying to see how far their drones could get before.
And what's the reaction from Poland?
Reaction from Poland, yeah. So
Yeah,
right now, it's all very interesting and very fascinating developments. Fortunately, the sum of which is very favorable for Ukraine, and
absolutely.
I think we can all give thanks for that.
Yeah,
And I said the only thing I can say now is don't. The phrase I like to use in this case is never take your foot off the neck of a dying cobra, because Russia is the dying cobra right now.
yeah.
It is reaching its end, but you don't want to take off the pressure. You don't want to let down your guard. You have to be careful, because if you take your foot off the neck of that cobra will lash out, and you don't want to be caught unprepared.
Yeah. Well, I think Ukrainians know what they're dealing with, and I think that they will not let that cobra to fight.
Don't let the cobra strike. Yeah, you don't give it a free strike.
Yeah. Jonathan, thank you very much for today's program. I wish you and all of our listeners a great weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday, same place, same time, and hopefully even with a better news. Although
Oh yeah.
today's news are fantastic. I was ecstatic.
Okay.
And with that, glory to Ukraine
God
and
bless
to
America. Yeah.
Canada. And
There we go. Yeah. Got to keep remembering to throw in Canada there.
absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye bye.